Some other really useful commands built in that you might find handy. Let's pick up right where we left off. As you can see, we've just finished running the DSQueries and DSGets from the last episode. Let's take a look now at some other things we can do. For example, with the DSQuery tool, when we look for users, there are some interesting aspects of the user that you might be interested in finding. Let's take a look at the help for this, just so we can take a look at what kind of things are available. When we look at the DSQuery help, you'll find that as we move down through here, we find things like stale password by number of days or inactive by number of weeks. These queries turn out to be extremely useful for finding out whether or not there are unnecessary accounts within our domain or users who are simply not changing their passwords. Now, in the last episode, we talked about how we could use a DSGet to find out whether or not the account is disabled with a non-expiring password. So if you'd like to look at that particular query, just go back to episode 9. But this is a little bit different. I want to find out if there are users who have not changed their password in a certain amount of time, which would tell me that the account has become inactive. Now, the query that's built in to let us do this is the stale PWD or stale password option, and I could just specify the number of days. For example, if we require that users change their passwords every 90 days, perhaps I'll do a DS query for stale passwords of 90 days or more. And in this particular domain, it's going to show everyone. You may remember from episode 9 that we're looking here at a test domain that we have, and these user accounts were created probably a year and a half ago. So that means that since no one logs in, none of these users have been forced to change their password. But within a normal domain, we would expect to find a list of users smaller than our typical user list. Now I'm just going to add the limit 0 because that's typically how we would run it, and I really wouldn't expect to find more than 100 entries, though I could. What kinds of accounts would it be typical to find that the password has not been changed or that the account appears to be stale? Well, I would typically expect to find this on built-in accounts, disabled accounts, the administrator account, and of course, service accounts. How you handle the service account passwords and what the changing requirements are within your environment is of course up to you, but for many organizations it's really not necessary to change the service account passwords, unless of course there's some serious problem that occurs, like an attacker gets in and steals the password hashes, because now those password hashes will be cracked and those accounts will be exposed. But barring that, since the accounts are never logged into, just choosing a long, strong password up front and escrowing that password is sufficient, provided no one needs to continually log in with that account. So the DS query for stale passwords can show us whether or not the account password has been changed. But there are other queries that can be useful too. For example, part of the maintenance in Active Directory is just making sure that the thing is cleaned up. Over time, Active Directory can just begin to collect records for things that just don't matter anymore. One of the big things, of course, is users that no longer work here, and finding stale passwords is one way to do it, though we can also do things like inactive to find users that have been inactive for a certain period of time. So this is another approach, though as you can see, we are only going to see reports for users who have actually logged in. So the stale password report is actually a much more useful report to find those inactive or accounts that people have logged into but have not been maintaining. The rest, since they've never been logged into, will never show up in this inactive report. But there are other things that we can find useful. For instance, DSQuery Computer will find all of the computer accounts within our domain. And in this test domain, we really do have a very small number. But within a typical domain, you could expect to find thousands, tens of thousands, very easily. This can become a lot to work with and can also just become full of garbage. So how can we clean it up? How can we identify the garbage? Well, we could do something like this. Let's do a DSQuery Computer, and let's find all of the computers that have been inactive for more than 8 weeks. And when we do that, we find that there's actually a good number. Some of these servers have no longer exist, and some of these workstations have also gone out of service. Yet, they still show up here within the domain. So, over time, as a computer is pulled out of service, what the administrator should be doing is pulling it out of the domain. Now, you can do that by simply deleting its records, but the proper way is to unjoin it from the domain. Is that happening when the administrators are pulling servers or workstations out of the domain? Well, I don't know. You'd have to find that out, but this DSQuery tool can be quite useful for doing so. Now remember, this inactive here is not looking at days, it's actually looking at weeks. So if we set this to 50 weeks, we'll find that it's a smaller list. These computers have not authenticated or connected into the domain in the last 50 weeks. Just a little bit more information about the stale password and the inactive information that we're pulling out of the domain. When we run DSQuery, it's actually going to run that query against the primary domain controller. I'm sorry, that's really the wrong name to use these days. It's going to run it against the nearest global catalog server. Now, for me, that happens to be one of the DCs here in the office. But you could end up, if you have multiple DCs, and some are closer than others, with some different information on some of those servers. However, this information is replicated when we're talking about password change information and last login information. But don't believe that that makes it useful for doing things like forensic investigations, because it doesn't. The password change information is useful, but the last login information is not. Now, prior to Windows Server 2003, perhaps even 2008, it was not the data for when a user last logged in was not replicated among domain controllers, and you would actually have to run a DSQuery against each of the domain controllers, or perhaps a DSGet for that particular user to find out the last time they logged in. Now, it is actually possible, let me just pull up the help here, to specify a specific server that you'd like to query. You'll notice up here that there's a -S option that allows us to query a particular domain controller. So we can ask it to do that. The reason is that in those older domains, you would find that different domain controllers would have different information about the last login, depending where the user last authenticated. Now, even today, that can still be useful, and you will find that not all of the servers have the same date on them, though there is some replication happening. However, they will only replicate this data if the date has been changed by more than a week from what the server already knows. This is just to limit what kind of data is replicated. But it does mean that I can tell whether or not an account has been inactive not for a certain number of days, but for a certain number of weeks. So we can use that to find both stale users, but also stale computer accounts. Now, in using this, do be cautious. You don't want to accidentally mark someone as being inactive when they're just on vacation. So you'd want to use a reasonable number of weeks here, something that's going to be a fair amount bigger than the greatest amount of vacation someone might take in your organization. There are, of course, a lot more things that we can do with DSQuery and DSGet. We're going to take a look at more of those in the next episode as well. I believe in episode 11 we're going to take a look at how we can pull out information regarding users and map that against an employee list very easily to see whether or not the users that still exist in our domain match up with the users that are actually employed by our company. But for now, that's the end of our episode. Please take a look at the show notes for any questions and an explanation of what we've done here. And if you do have any questions or comments, of course, always feel free to add a comment or just email that question in.